Good. So with all the introductions I already got from Christian Fiala and Henry Bowell, I can jump right to the first slide and ask you, why don't we have the answers? Oh, well, see, this is probably not good. Maybe I shouldn't on this one here. Let's see, here, I have to get used to synchronizing this one. Oh, does it work? Yeah, oh yeah, it does work. So oops, let me get used to this a little bit. Is it? Yeah, okay. So see, I'm looking at our poster that you all had in your mail, and I have in my laptop here these great questions. Not bad, whoever came up with them. I think Fiala and Uta, or whoever it was. Why don't we have answer to these questions? They're very fundamental questions. Why has there been no AIDS epidemic in Europe and in the US and in Asia in 25 years? Although we were told and see reports of millions of HIV positive, particularly in the most advanced country in the world, the United States. And where's the vaccine? Remember Edward Jenner, an English country doctor 200 years ago? He was faced with a pox epidemic, connected that cows had something similar, prepared, invented the vaccine, had the vaccine ready for 60 pounds in one season. Now we have the most affluent, the most advanced, most sophisticated scientific community the planet has ever seen. They're working on it for 26 years, and say maybe 10 years from now, and roughly $20 billion further down, we might have a vaccine. Still no vaccine. So what happened to this money? That's a great question. I liked all of these questions. I think I could have published them all myself, but I couldn't answer them all in one lecture, so I focused on two. I think I'm moving this thing too fast. Let me see. Is that the next? Have to practice moving. Now it doesn't move. Well, let's see. Here. There's some Spanish in it, but no. Let's see. Because I think the problem is that we don't. The reason why we don't answers to these questions because we have to believe AIDS is something, or led to or taught to believe AIDS is something that it really isn't. We believe, or better are taught to believe, that AIDS is the newest of the great microbial epidemics to which the plague, the flus, and the choleras and polios belong. This belief has generated numerous paradoxes and unanswerable questions like those listed in the cui bono AIDS poster. But there are no paradoxes in nature. There are only flawed hypotheses. And I think, as Henry concluded in the end, the virus AIDS hypothesis is perhaps the biggest of those in scientific history. There hasn't been a bigger flawed hypothesis yet. So, but to appreciate why I'm saying this, I remind you of the basis of the germ theory, which is rarely ever mentioned in connection with AIDS anymore. Perhaps people haven't thought about it or even don't want to think about it anymore. We believe, let's say, oh, I see, this has to move. Is it? No, it's a funny writing here, but if it changes the script here from this to that. If you could connect it to this, might be even better, but let me see. Can you read it well? Is it okay? Yeah. Okay, the HIV, AIDS, and the germ theory of disease. So here I want to remind you what they are. And the germ theory, the hypothesis that HIV is the cause of AIDS is generally presented to us as a modern example of the classical germ theory of disease. The best summary of this is the Durban Declaration of 2000. Yeah, here it's also. It does change the script somewhat, but not here. No, here it's fine. Okay, good. So since Koch and Pasteur in the 1980s, and before them Semmelweis in Vienna, the germ theory has been the major success story in the history of biology and medicine. Every medical student and biology student has in the back of his mind imprinted, even now in Berkeley, the better students, we find a vaccine against cancer, like Heil zu Hause, and we vaccinate, you don't get cervical cancer anymore, and we vaccinate against the RAS gene, and you don't have colon cancer anymore. And against HIV, it's no more AIDS, and I'll be famous, I'll have my picture in the textbooks, I have a company, I have dates, and I have money, and I'm an admired scientist. That's the plan that is deep in the mind, implanted of all biologists. And it is based on Koch and Pasteur, who first isolated these germs, and before them, of course, Semmelweis, and showed that preventing these diseases are preventable by sanitation and by vaccines and by antibiotics. And this has been the big success story of science. Infectious diseases have been reduced to less than 1% of mortality and morbidity in the world, in the Western world, that is. And say classical examples I already mentioned: the flu, the polio, and the plague epidemics. And the virus, the AIDS virus, was added to this prestigious list just a day after it was first announced in 1984 at a press conference, not in a peer-reviewed journal, as the anonymous peer-reviewed journal like Science, The Lancet, and Nature. There was, oh wait, I have to push on this button here. But despite this unprecedented, I would say almost outrageous propaganda for the virus hypothesis since 1984, the questions persist that cannot be answered in terms of the classic germ theory to this very date. And several of those, as I said already, are pointed out in the poster that we have. Oh, and let's see, I chips here. So here I'm trying to focus on two of those. In extension, in fact, was Christian Fiala and Henry Bauer already said, why are huge epidemics reported in Africa but not in the US and Europe and in Asia? And why is it not published that the African population has practically doubled, presumably in a time when we had these devastating epidemics? And at a first attempt at answering these questions with my colleagues, Fiala and Bauer, and two others who are not here today, Josh Nicholson and David Rasnick, and we published this in Medical Hypothesis, and it was published last year for 2 months, and then it was censored. Together with a paper, amidst other sanctions and other authors, one of them sits here, Ruggiero, he published a similar paper from Florence, and because it also questioned HIV-AIDS, was censored all along. The editor was fired, and the journal was changed. It was a perfect Nazi move. We get into the whole publishing house, change it, throw out the papers we don't want, create a new journal, and have unanimity created overnight. So now we are going to tell you what we have tried to say and have said it is, and I remind you first what actually the germ theory directly predicts. So here's what we should expect if AIDS were indeed a viral disease, a modern example of the germ theory. We would expect a new pathogenic virus or microbe to manifest itself by causing an epidemic of new microbe-specific, and that's very important. Microbes have very low genetic IQs. They can't do too many things at once, and often not even one thing. So they cannot cause multiple diseases. They usually cause one, and the viruses have the lowest IQ of them all. They are named after the one and only thing they usually do: flu, hepatitis, measles, yellow fever, what have you. Such an epidemic now spreads exponentially. That means very fast in a population within weeks to months. It's not something that starts in Bethesda in '84 and spreads to Johannesburg in 2014 and to San Francisco in 2020. Within weeks or months, because a newly infected carrier infects dozens of others, susceptible carriers. Thus, a germ epidemic runs very much like a biochemical chain reaction. One infected person infects 10, and 10 infect 100, and 100 infect thousands. Until the population of susceptible population is infected and either killed or rendered resistant by immunity. And then the job or the market for the microbe is dead, and the disease or epidemic declines just as fast as it appeared, exponentially. The resulting bell-shaped epidemiological curves of illnesses and deaths were first transcribed for a plague in London. Oh, I keep pushing the wrong. I should learn to here. This is 1665, a plague in London, described, the first one described, and that's the first bell-shaped curve cited in the textbooks of epidemiology to this very day. Within weeks, the mortality, is there a pointer? We have a pointer or no? Not a pointer, stick? In the middle. Oh, it's an electric thing again. It's not a stick, no. Oh, sorry. Oh, this one. No, I see. Okay. Anyway, you can see here, it goes, here, the important thing is the abscissa here. We're talking in weeks. In AIDS, it's all decades, but here we talk in weeks. Within weeks, the mortality in London goes up to 8,000 per week, which was a lot at that time. London was like 200,000 people, and then it declined again, and 20 weeks later, it was all gone. And here is another classical example. We get from Google Images. This is the true Spanish flu of 1918, which presumably killed more people than World War I. And look at the curves. Here's the mortality, the normal mortality of, at that time, around 10 to 15 per year per 1,000. And it goes up sixfold in New York, in London, in Paris, and in Berlin, almost at the same time. We don't have jets yet, but they move faster than the bird and the swine flus of the CDC that take years to arrive, and occasionally you see a dead bird and nothing happens until the next one is announced in the CDC's program. But this one really moved fast, faster than jets move, and it was very tight. You can see within 2 months the mortality was normal, and about presumably 20 million people have died in that epidemic. And this is a more modern example, the polio epidemics of the 40s, 50s. Here's the United States, a typical summer polio epidemic. They came and went, July, August, September, October. It went up to these cases, again from Google, a polio epidemic, in the classical bell-shaped curve. So the biological basis for these fast kinetics of these biological chain reactions are not a black box. They're not a mystery, and we understand them completely. We can explain them 100% why it takes a week or a couple of days from an infection to symptoms of a disease. It's strictly a function of multiplying bacteria or viruses that you receive naturally unless somebody injects you with millions of viruses in a blood transfusion, typically by natural contacts, sex or what have you, or kisses or huffing and coughing. You get a few infecting microbes, and they multiply bacteria once every 30 minutes. They double viruses 100 to 1,000-fold per day. So within a few days, you have exponentially achieved a pathogenic threshold. You have billions out of one microbe, and the maximal multiplication coincides with disease symptoms. You don't get disease from a latent virus or from a slow virus or an endogenous virus that can be discovered with the polymerase chain reaction on the bench or with antibodies that react with something or another that we will discuss with Henry Bauer for the rest of the day after my talk. So there is no room for a slow microbe or a slow virus. That's an invention that paid off handsomely to Dr. Gajdusek and subsequently in prions to others, but has never been truly confirmed. So in awe of the germ of the germ epidemic, which every biologist actually starts genuflecting when you cite that you have a virus of a disease. The New York Times, even the world's or the nation's most critical journal, named a newly discovered retrovirus, AIDS virus, in 1904, just because antiviral antibodies were found in 1 out of 3 patients. That was Gallo's discovery in April or in May 1984. The press release was in April. The next morning, the New York Times called it the AIDS virus. And what Gallo had really shown is not the virus. The virus just came from Paris a year earlier, but he could find in patients only antibodies against it. And if you look at the figure, only 1 in 3. And Science is said to be a prestigious heterosexual peer-reviewed journal in which we would be immediately excluded or rejected as in medicine. So that's why medical hypothesis is now also a peer-reviewed journal. The peers didn't notice that there was no virus, only antibodies, and didn't mind what is now sort of called Koch's postulates. If a virus is a candidate of a disease, it has to be present at least in 100%. There's more to it, but at least it has to be present. Here it's only in 1 of 3 patients. Without any further delay, the most prestigious national scientific club in the US, the National Academy of some of the best research scientists in AIDS belong, or in retroviruses belong, and the Institute of Medicine appointed a blue ribbon committee headed by David Baltimore to confront the expected epidemic that would spread through the nation and infect the heterosexual college kids. They come home with AIDS, and mom and dad are embarrassed or don't know what to do. So the committee was supposed to warn them what to do. And here's what they said, literally, published by the National Academy in Confronting AIDS after meeting for a year. They said at that time already, there are 1 to 1.5 million Americans currently infected with HIV. Of these, 20 to 30% are expected to develop AIDS by 1991, acquired through heterosexual contact, and it will increase from 1,100 cases in 86 to 7,000 in 91, and pediatric AIDS, because maternal transmission they already knew, would increase almost tenfold through the next 5 years to more than 3,000 cumulative cases. They were already politically correct enough to not mention homosexuals. They were the only ones at the time, so they said, we're all in this together, with Liz Taylor and Rock Hudson, David Baltimore, Peter Duesberg, and Anthony Fauci. We were all at risk, same risk, except of the 10,000 AIDS researchers, and I know HIV-AIDS researchers who have worked and produced billions of viruses to make antigens for antibodies, not one in 25 years, in the absence of a vaccine, has ever contracted AIDS from this deadly virus, according to peer-reviewed case reports in the New England Journal, in JAMA, in Nature, Science, Medizinische Wochenschrift, or what you have. Not one. So they're of course very sophisticated, and they do know how to avoid it, the deadly virus. Unlike, people we already know who doesn't avoid it. But here's now 26 years later, there is no heterosexual epidemic and no pediatric epidemic in Europe, in Asia, in the US, in South America, to this very day. AIDS remained in all of these continents restricted to major risk groups, IV drug users, male homosexuals using psychoactive aphrodisiac anti-drugs. Except perhaps in Africa. They have hinted at it over and over, but there was still no paper that really gave specific results until Mike Sessex, a member of the Bob Club, or the Retrovirus Club, since the early days, I know him from the early days, good friend of Bob Gallo's. He was one of the first to warn the nation of an infectious disease. He published at last in 2008 with Chigwedere from Harvard that HIV had killed 1.8 million South Africans between 2000 and 2005. Again, in a peer-reviewed journal, JAIDS, I'm sure Bob Gallo and Danny Bolognesi reviewed it very carefully, checked the numbers exactly. And here, the estimates, they called all of these numbers estimates because it was generated in a computer at Charles River in Harvard, and then again from information, as you see, that came from Lake Geneva, also a little away from the epicenter, and the World Health Organization. They have also nice computers there. Better than this one, even it would have better spelling than in this computer. Moreover, Essex and Chigwedere complained at the same time in their paper that 330,000 of those 1.8 million that were lost in those 5 years from HIV, they could have been saved with antiviral drugs if that hadn't been blocked by President Mbeki, who was under the influence of a small number of scientists. Some of them had been named in the papers who are denialists, that deny HIV-AIDS. So if correct then, if the Harvard study were correct scientifically, it would have found the first general HIV-AIDS epidemic that the National Academy and the Secretary of Health and Human Services and Gallo predicted in 1984, now a little late in 2008. However, this discovery defines a biological or scientific paradox. The paradox is, how could the same virus that, doesn't know any borders, the virus doesn't know any borders, the doctors don't know any borders, globally, the same virus would kill 1.8 million South Africans, although it had failed to cause any epidemic in the US, and Europe, and Asia. To put it slightly differently, why was there no such epidemic in the US with 1 million HIV positives? We read it from David Baltimore and the Institute of Medicine in 1985 and 86, since 85, many of which African Americans, as they're called by us now, who are genetically very close to those who are still in Africa, 2 or 3 generations away, maybe 3 or 4 point mutations per year, but close enough for the virus to find out these are the guys I'm allowed to infect and cause epidemics in. But it wouldn't do it in America. It knew how to behave. So to solve Essex's African paradox, we asked, that is Bauer and Fiala, and Duesberg and Nicholson and Russell, what is the evidence for the huge losses of the South African lives that were claimed by Essex and Chigwedere? And what is the evidence that these guys could have been saved or benefited from the anti-HIV drugs that they dutifully recommended, particularly AZT and Nevirapine were mentioned. So our first look was to look at the sources that they cite, the World Health Organization. So the World Health Organization was listed as a source of the statistics for which Essex and Chigwedere did their calculations or estimates. But as we found out, surprisingly, looking up reported HIV cases and AIDS cases of South Africa in the epidemiological fact sheet for the period 96 to 97, there was truly nothing there, as they would say about Oakland. There's nothing there. Gertrude Stein used to say that. But you can see here are the original numbers. I think Fiala said I had a flawed slide in there. You should look at it. It's a perfect slide. It's exactly what is published now by the World Health Organization on Lake Geneva. Beautiful lake, nice computers, Rolex watches. But see, the tables are already there. As soon as they find one, they put it in. This is what Essex from Harvard University cited as the evidence from which they estimated the numbers. It's right, I can show you the original. You can Google it right now while I'm talking. There is nothing there. Neither one. They say, they make estimates, but, from stories, but the numbers are not there at all. So we were slightly disappointed, so maybe we were paranoid and questioned everybody. But as we already know, Henry mentioned it, Christian Fiala mentioned it, we were not the only ones to doubt HIV statistics. The recent chief of surveillance, they have these pompous names, the chief of surveillance, forecasting, impact assessment, global program and and AIDS and sex and whatever it is, of the WHO, Professor James Chin from Berkeley, very prestigious university with very few denialists, wrote in his book, "The AIDS Pandemic, the collision of epidemiology with political correctness." That is quite courageous for him to write even. He said, he made up for it. He said he hates Duesberg, he holds a cross if he comes even close to the virus lab. But he wrote in this program, AIDS programs developed by international agencies and faith-based on organizations have been and continue to be more socially, politically, moralistically, I didn't know they were moralistically so correct, but maybe they must be all like Gallo and Fauci, than epidemiologically accurate. More recently, the WHO has been accused, as I just read in the news media, of manipulating epidemiological numbers of a new flu epidemic. Maybe it's now an alligator flu that is coming to us up the River Thames. It's in the British Medical Journal. Who knows? They better watch out, the Englishmen. So next we searched the African-American statistics for evidence of 1.8 million losses in South Africa. So surprisingly again, Statistics South Africa, they have their own statistics, and Mbeki was pretty good at that. And the US Census Bureau show steady annual gains instead of the losses that Essex and Al deplore 500,000 people per year for the period from 2000 to 2005. Instead of declining from Essex's epidemic, the South African population had increased by 3 million from 44 to 47 in the time in which Essex and the Harvard study had estimated losses of 1.8 million. The reality was we had increased by 3 million. So see, the bell-shaped curve is mortality. In population, it would be like an opposite bell-shaped curve. We would have mortality would have a loss of the population corresponding to the mortality. That's what we expected, but what we have is a gain of 3 million and a claimed loss of 1.8 million. At the same time, the Department of Health in South Africa also reported that the population was 25 to 30% positive for antibody against HIV. That's from maternal clinics. They claim this is not the right one. But Essex quoted, in fact, we are in agreement with Essex on that. He quoted almost the same numbers, different sources. I think, again, the WHO, we didn't dare to look at them anymore. So here's the numbers. I'll give you a little more about this in a second, but here is the population statistics, and they virtually coincide, Statistics South Africa and US Census. You can access it again right now from your laptop. The US Census Bureau is on the same mall as the White House and the National Academy. They're in the middle of it, so, and the publishing officer for science, they should know that the population has increased. But Science and Nature, the New York Times, or the Academy have never mentioned a word since the AIDS epidemic that the population is increasing in Africa. We only hear that Bill Gates and President Bush go down there with dollars or laptops or condoms to save the poor Africans. But never come home with AIDS. That's also a miracle. But anyway, this is, in terms of the germ theory, it's not very good. I mean, but otherwise, it's very, very humanitarian. So as you can see, the population goes up roughly 500,000 a year from 44 to 47 in those 6 years, according to Africa and the US. And only Africa reports the antibody positives. They go from 24 to 30%, and it's sort of fluctuate. They're saturating in that time period. So I'm ever trying, of course, to accommodate studies that come from Harvard University. You know, it's the most prestigious of the prestigious university. Even Berkeley is second rate compared to Harvard. So whatever Essex publishes has to be taken serious. And I tried. We tried very hard. We said, is there it's quite possible. Maybe we asked whether there are statistics that confirmed this deplorable losses of 300,000 that Essex and Chigwedere had discovered in their computers, and with the help of the WHO. It is, of course, theoretically possible that South Africa gained 500 and at the same time lost 300 per year from AIDS deaths. Considering what we all know about the unchristian replication and sexual behavior of these guys, it's always possible. that they out-replicated even the deadly virus and compensated for any losses. We would mask it completely by overproducing babies. You know how they behave, you know, unchristian as it is. So, but surprisingly, again, we were prepared to help Harvard or explain, understand Harvard. Surprisingly, again, the mortalities attributed to HIV by Statistics South Africa were consistently low. Between 2000 and 2005, the average was 10,000 per year. Now, that sounds not totally negligible, but you have to put it in context. There were 50 million, roughly, South Africans. Life expectancy is 50 years. That means 2% die per year. That's 1 million normal mortality per year. So we're talking about an extra plus or minus 10,000. That's 1% of the total mortality. Take into consideration that HIV doesn't cause a disease of its own. We're talking about normal mortality under the name of AIDS. It's typically tuberculosis, pneumonia, or something like that. So they set aside 1% of their primary mortality as AIDS-related or HIV deaths, probably to please the authorities, whoever it was. So the Harvard study overestimated AIDS deaths that of 10,000, 30-fold, because they claimed 300,000. Were there AIDS deaths? I only commented on it. That's another question. So here's the sum. Oh God, this computer really changes a few things. This is actually a minus. I don't know how it makes it an S, but. So the Harvard study finds a minus of 1.8 million. It must be, I think, an incompatibility between Macs and PCs. They often do that to each other. But I can show you on my own slide here, it's a minus, and this is a plus. So we have a discrepancy of 4.8 million here to talk about. The South African statistics and the US Census Bureau in those 5 years say plus 3 million, 500 per year, 500,000 per year. The Harvard study says minus 1.8 million. So there's another problem with the claim that the peer-reviewed journals in which this is published, like JAIDS, or Science, or Nature, never mentioned. Namely, that the claims that we have steady losses or mortality of 300,000 per year for 6 years is incompatible with the germ theory for a new epidemic. This is said to be a new epidemic. A new infectious epidemic or pathogen usually causes or always causes a bell-shaped morbidity and mortality curves that rise exponentially and then decline exponentially. Remember the picture of the flu and the plague and the polio epidemics I showed you. And that was deliberate. I showed you those to tell you how a new germ would behave, and we understand why it behaves that way if it's entering a new population. A steady mortality over years, like 300,000, 6 years in a row, instead is only compatible with a lifestyle disease associated with either non-microbial health risks, like smoking or starving or malnutrition, or opportunistic epidemic microbial diseases like tuberculosis. If you don't have enough to eat and don't have sanitation, your immune system is down and you get tuberculosis. The AIDS researchers who travel to Africa never come home with AIDS, only with nice pictures and great numbers in their computers. We conclude that Essex's South African epidemic is numerically flawed and incompatible with the germ theory. In fact, totally incompatible with the germ theory. Let me see, is that the next one or was it this one? Let's see. Yeah. So we propose instead that since the South African population increased by 500 per year from 2000 to 2005, although it was 20 to 30% HIV positive, that HIV is a non-pathogenic passenger virus that has nothing to do with population growth. To test this proposal, we have compared the population growth curve of South Africa with the growth curve there showing HIV prevalence. And let me see, is that? Well, our proposal predicts, of course, that the growth curve would be independent and the HIV would be independent, and actually exactly like Henry said half an hour ago, that they would be not correlating with each other. And here you see the curves. This is plotted from the Statistics South Africa or from US Census Bureau, the population growth going 1980, when presumably the epidemic started, according to Piot and on these genii that we heard yesterday in the movie. And the population goes up literally like crazy, from 28 million to close to 50 million during this tragic HIV-AIDS era. And it is a very monotonic curve, as you call it. It goes very steady, you would expect if there were epidemics of the sort that they describe, suddenly there would be bumps in that curves, and that's if HIV goes up, as the HIV prevalence curve shows, there should be a corresponding dip in the population growth. In fact, that curve is so steady or monotonic, as you would say mathematically, that given it to 2000, when Essex and Chigwedere and the World Health Organization started to analyze the South African epidemic, we could have predicted just by putting a ruler here, extrapolating a little bit over here from 2000 to 2005, that 3 million were gained. Exactly as it came out from the curve until then, the trajectory is so consistent, so monotonic, we could have said it would have been another 3 million. And that's exactly what it was, that Harvard missed, unfortunately. But anyways, they got a good paper, and they got another one out, and they will get funds to revise it probably soon. To determine whether the steady population growth in South Africa, despite concurrent HIV epidemics, was an exception, or perhaps also another, we called Christian Fjall. And he became a co-author as a result. He knew more about it, or as much about it than we did already, and more about Uganda. And he pointed out already earlier that the Ugandan population exploded ever since he was there studying AIDS. I know he's a potent man, but even he, you will see, could have not possibly been responsible for that alone. It's even better than in South Africa. It went from 12 million to 30 million. That's about 3 times higher. So, I don't know, maybe he took Viagra along, whatever it is, AZT and condoms, of course, and laptops too. But it was impressive what he produced there. And here's again our good old friend, the World Health Organization. If you look at the original data, there's only empty boxes, but nevertheless, they come up with nice colored graphs. I don't know where they get it from, but the original sources are empty, but they have their points. And they say it's estimates, and these estimates were in turn used at Harvard to make further estimates. But if you have a good computer, you can do a lot of things. So now we thought, let's go to a higher level yet, take the whole of Sub-Saharan Africa. We could be wrong in Uganda and wrong in... They always have these explanations. There are people traveling from Uganda to South Africa, and that's why the population stays high. By the millions, of course. But I heard when I was there, quite a few are leaving also, but no, who knows. But anyway, so we took the whole of South Africa. The World Bank is one source of it. And again, even the World Health Organization can be used under the American Census Bureau. They found out that in the HIV-AIDS era, the Sub-Saharan African population has gone from 400 to 800 million. That is the equivalent of all people in Europe from Portugal to the Ural. 400 million extra people. Not so bad. I thought we could at last say, I'm not only saying bad things about HIV, HIV could, we argue, to have doubled the population of Africa. I should at last I should be in headlines tomorrow, Duesberg, advancing HIV, to finally make up for the losses in Africa by doubling the population. I think I should get credit for it, a little bit at least. So now the last question, can Africans benefit from anti-HIV drugs? As Essex claims, we can go over this quickly. This indeed is incompatible. We have reservations about this from the germ theory of viral disease, inherent toxicities of antiviral drugs, which have already been covered, and the evidence that HIV is not pathogenic. Should you treat a non-pathogenic virus? with DNA chain terminators. You don't have to, but I think it's probably a bit more radical than needed. So now, the genetic, here's the terms, what the germ theory says about the feasibility of antiviral drugs. Anyone, general, anywhere. The genetic complexity of all viruses is much too low to synthesize their own nucleic acids and make their own proteins. That was one of the classic papers of Crick and Watson. It was Crick first and Watson. In 1956, they said because of their extremely low complexity, they have to rely on the cell for all of their proteins, and they have to use the same proteins over and over to make their codes. 2 or 3, that's all they can do. They have just 2 or 3 genes. I have worked on retroviruses. In fact, the genetic map of retroviruses was worked on in my map. It has a very low IQ. HIV, chicken viruses, mouse viruses, all have the same genetic map. GAG, pollen, ELF, and ELF, 9 kilobases. That's very, very low in biology. Extremely low, hardly as low as you can get. Therefore, all viruses are obligatory parasites, depending on the host cell for synthesis of any of their DNAs and RNAs and proteins. It is for this reason that all inhibitors of virus replication, theoretically, and as we'll see in a minute, practically, are inhibitors of cell replication. You can't distinguish. It's made in the same computer. You just put in a disk for your talk or for the next guy's talk. That you can do, different virus. But the machine inside is all the same. Even nature has never evolved antiviral drugs in 3 billion years. And I think it's unlikely that Gallo, Bolognese, and Poder would have found one 3 billion years into evolution. Nature has invented all the antibiotics, but on the basis that you have a foreign cell, another cell in it, that is slightly different. And E. coli has its own ribosomes. You can find inhibitors for E. coli ribosomes that don't touch ours, or E. coli polymerase that don't touch ours. And that's how antibiotics work, or antifungal things work. But there is nothing ever against viruses, except, of course, immunity, which works against all foreign things, cells and viruses. It's immunity that protects us from fusion with somebody else. Sex is sort of a mini exception that I don't understand. No, but they will understand it. Fauci would understand probably sex better. So now wait, here control. Now control trials of the toxicity of so-called antiviral drugs confirm this theory. The first, I just mentioned 3 and that will be all. The first placebo-controlled trial of AZT carried out in the US together with Burroughs Wellcome from England, showed life-threatening anemia in 24%. That's from the summary of their paper, Richmond, in the New England Journal of Medicine. In 24%, neutropenia in 60% within several weeks after treatment of AIDS patients. That's pretty fast. In addition, serious adverse reactions, particularly bone marrow suppression, was observed, nausea, myalgia, insomnia, headaches. That's in the paper, in their paper on the placebo-controlled trial. Frequent macrocytosis and all of this in the same AZT group. What they didn't say, but is in the paper to read, it's not in the abstract, 30 of those 149 in the treatment group that were doing so well were only kept alive by weekly transfusions because their bone marrow was so far down, they would have suffocated without red cells. The rest they could do with antibiotics. By 21 months, the same group, 42% of them were dead. The control group, 35% were also dead. You would say the HIV is still a bad virus, but if you read a little bit the details, not the abstract, you'll find that the control group had been put on AZT 3 months after the great benefits were touted of the other group, so they had it on a compassionate basis. I think this is a euphemism for euthanasia, isn't it? Or something like that. Compassionate basis AZT is euthanasia, in my opinion. But anyway, so they died then rapidly too. AIDS patients died too. So that's the first controlled study. Now there is a second one, a huge one, the best of its kind, the so-called French-British Concord study, published in the peer-reviewed journal The Lancet. They looked at, in 94, at 1,700 HIV positives. Could HIV prevent the onset of AIDS? And here's what they've concluded. The results of Concord do not encourage the early use of pseudobulin, AZT, in symptom-free HIV-infected adults. If you go into the text, you'll find the recipients of the AZT had a 25% higher mortality than the control group, confirming the earlier study. What's new in the antiviral business is that now they acknowledge more and more that half of all American AIDS patients now die from diseases that are not blamed on HIV yet. They can't be, you can't say, okay, this one got immunodeficiency because HIV is causing it and AZT would have just slows it down. These are diseases that HIV is not yet set to cause. They get liver, about here, drug cocktails. Here. One of the first was Reisler et al. The most common grade 4 events, serious life-threatening events that are not AIDS-defining. It's in the journal like that, were liver-related, cardiovascular events, and the first grade 4 and first AIDS event were associated with similar risks. So under these treatments, you get either AIDS or you get the non-AIDS defining fatal disease at 50-50%. So some die from a non-defining disease at the same time as the guys with AIDS die with this kind of treatment. And this was confirmed several times, and important here that's again in New England Journal of Medicine. An important secondary endpoint was major cardiovascular, renal, and hepatic disease. So these are diseases that HIV is not causing. It has to be drug caused because there was no other explanation. Now here's Nevirapine, recommended by Essex, particularly for mother-child transmission. And as Henry Bauer found out, the NIH wrote this nice summary of how good Nevirapine really is. Celia Faber had a great story on it yesterday in the movie. The risk of several non-AIDS defining, this is funny computer, conditions including cardiovascular diseases, liver-related events, and renal disease, and certain non-AIDS malignancy is as great than the risk of AIDS in persons with CD4 cell counts over 200. That means in German, people who have no AIDS and get these, that is babies who have no AIDS and get these drugs, they have a higher risk of getting these diseases than AIDS. People over 200 cells per cubic millimeter, that's an otherwise healthy baby, HIV positive, is more likely to get these diseases than AIDS from what Essex and Harvard at Harvard says this is beneficial for mother-to-child transmission. My final recommendation, in view of the inevitable toxicity of antiviral drugs and the evidence that HIV is not pathogenic, not biochemically active in HIV-positive people, and thus not even susceptible to inhibition by drugs, we conclude that antiviral drugs are not beneficial for the prevention and treatment of AIDS. Limited applications. Is Klaus Köhnlein here? Yeah, he's here. He's moving close to the orthodoxy now. He's prescribing more and more antiviral drugs and does some human experiments. It's legal stuff in this field. It's all done. All these things are tested on babies and homosexuals and African Americans and whoever. Limited applications might provide, however, unspecific serendipitous benefits against some AIDS-defining and non-defining diseases, much like mercury and arsenic against syphilis in the good old days of alchemy. And it's actually true. They are biochemically active. They're inhibiting all sorts of things. The things that's most active, let's say if you're full of pneumocystis or streptococcus or pneumococcus, that's one that dies first. And this was the success of the mercuries and the arsenics of the good old days, except they treated people for way too long. And then it went to the head, and Nietzsche or Schumann walked in the Rhine, and Nietzsche became even more mishuggah than he already was when he didn't have syphilis left. If they had limited the treatment to a month or two, they would have been fine. But if the standard treatment of syphilis with mercury was 2 years, a gram a day. That's very bad for your brain. Our colleague Köhnlein has described actually such cases. Indeed, he uses it to much advantage. It's available, it's legal, it's free. Why not? And if it's limited, it does help to get rid of all these critters before the patient dies. And that's what counts in medicine. To advance this important experience of Köhnlein and others too, I suggest to real science, we propose to test anti-HIV drugs in animals rather than in humans with and without HIV diseases. That might be a hint to all these activists. They all call for more drugs in them and want to see what happens. And we saw already a lot what happens. Many of them died. Why don't they do what scientists used to do? There used to be a gold standard, testing drugs, giving it to your cat, your dog, your guinea pig, and your mouse for a while and see how they are doing. It's quite a legitimate type of the metabolism of these mammals is very close to ours. If they do really well, then we can now move on and give it to our beloved risk groups. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Good. animals is hopeless. You can put 2 chicken or 2 mice together, one positive, one negative. It almost never happens that they, with Strauss sarcomas, that the other one gets the tumor.
Next question, please.
Mr. Duesberg, I have a question back to the roots. So there's this dispute between the AIDS dissidents, whether HIV exists or not. There's one part which is saying it's not existing, and you, on the contrary, are saying it's existing, but it's harmless, it's a retrovirus.
Yeah.
And this is kind of confusing. So could you explain your position on contrary to the other?
Well, let me say at least first what my position is. It's not terribly confusing if you worked with retroviruses for 20 years or even for 1. They are almost always harmless and latent. We have invested dearly in that program for 10, 20 years. At that time, proportionally almost as much as in AIDS and cancer research in the 60s and 70s. There were books of Cold Spring Harbor books, and I give you 2, for example. They are summarized in there that were found in this program in animals and in humans. In humans, not so many, it was hard to find, but mostly in inbred animals. By inbreeding, you breed out resistance factors, and you get expression of viruses that are in wild animals and outbred animals suppressed, and then you get them high, and that's why they were favorable. But it is very, very common to have non-pathogenic endemic retroviruses in all vertebrates that we have looked at. Snakes and fish and birds and sheep and goats and monkeys and humans. So there is nothing spectacular about saying here's another one.
I
See
think
what I'm saying?
the next speaker, Etienne, will talk about HERVs, endogenous retroviruses, and maybe we can discuss that aspect after his presentation. He may contribute to that question. So last question, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to...
oh, sorry. So we have two more questions. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes?
I'd just like to address that young man.
Could you speak a little more closely?
I would like to just address the young man who keeps saying the retrovirus.
That must be me, huh?
The retrovirus. Yes.
Yeah.
The retroviruses. He felt better when he took the retroviruses. I talked to a lot of AIDS groups, and many of the young men who were HIV positive have been on a lot of drugs. And what they have done concomitantly is also improve their diets and stop the drugs. They changed their lifestyles. And so we don't know, I mean, it hasn't been said what the lifestyle was to get you to an HIV positivity, but there was a lifestyle. So now you take the drugs and you also do these other things. So which is working? That's the question.
Thank you. And the last question, please.
Yeah, so you had a question on this. What's better or what? No.
Yeah, no, I was just commenting on
Yeah.
the role of the drugs. It's a coincidence.
Thank you.
What is the coincidence? That it gets better with the drugs?
No, coincidence it gets better because his habits have gotten better.
That,
He started the drugs.
Please,
yeah.
please.
Yeah.
Stop the other lifestyle.
Yeah. Well, I would say without drugs, the lifespan or the mortality is with and without HIV exactly the same as we know from the African numbers and even know from the CDC. They say 40 million. Most of them don't even know they have HIV. It's only the risk groups where you see high mortality. And risk groups means either recreational or antiviral drugs. People without knowledge of HIV, look at Africa. The population is literally exploding, and a third of them in the natal clinics, neonatal or prenatal clinics, measure positive, whatever that means. But they produce the babies that double the country. How can that be fatal or even bad? And it is so in mice, it's so in chicken, it's so in rats, it's so in monkeys. Any retrovirus we studied, they are perinatally transmitted. Anything theoretically that is perinatally transmitted is either, if it's fatal, that's the end of the microbe and the host. If it is consistently done, it's harmless. Nothing that goes from mother to child that's normally transmitted there can be fatal.
So, last speaker, please. Last question, please.
Yeah, Ich darf mich kurz vorstellen, mein Name ist Helmut Pilhar, ich bin der Vater von der Olivia. Ich versuche seit 15 Jahren das Wissen vom Dr. Metrike Gerd Hamer, die germanische Heilkunde, zu verbreiten.
Entschuldigung, darf ich Sie nur ganz kurz unterbrechen? Könnten Sie eine Frage zu Peter Duesberg oder
ja,
zu
genau. Ich
seinem
hätte
Vortrag?
eine konkrete Frage, und zwar, wir können ja diese Kongresse abhalten, 30 Jahre, nicht nur über AIDS, sondern auch über Krebs, über Ansteckung, über Allergien. Es weiß ja die Schulmedizin oder die bisherige Wissenschaft von nichts die Ursache. Und der Dr. Hamer hat 5 biologische Naturgesetze ausformuliert, die reproduzierbar sind am nächstbesten Fall. Und Dr. Hamer sagt, das Ganze hat nichts, das AIDS hat nichts mit Virus zu tun, das HIV gibt es gar nicht, sondern AIDS oder der HIV-Test ist nichts anderes als ein Allergienachweis auf das männliche Smegma. Und diese Aussage von Dr. Hamer kann man überprüfen. Während alles, was hier vorgetragen wurde, Statistiken und so, das ist ja nicht reproduzierbar am nächstbesten Fall. Ich verstehe nicht, warum der Dr. Hamer nicht endlich einmal, auch von Ihnen, Herr Dr. Duesberg, Sie kennen den Dr. Hamer seit 1990. Ich erinnere an Raum und Zeit,
Entschuldigung, Herr Piller, was ist Ihre Frage? Bitte kommen Sie zurück auf
meine
die Frage.
Frage ist, warum überprüfen Sie nicht die Aussage von Dr. Hamer?
HIV-Nachweis
ist nichts anderes als ein Allergienachweis auf das männliche Smegma.
Ich habe leider das meiste nicht verstanden. Jetzt habe ich den...
Ich wiederhole mich gern noch einmal.
Die Akustik ist so schlecht.
Ohne Sie.
Er sagt, HIV ist eine Allergie auf Smegma und kein Virus.
Ach so, okay. Allergie, HIV ist Allergie oder aus Smegma, kein Virus. So, I mean, wouldn't be a good test to check the girls all here in the room, see whether they have any HIV? Now, if it's only a response to Smegma, the girls at last would be excused completely. They're already a minority in that field. Isn't it true?
Darf ich vorschlagen, die Zeit ist wirklich, wir haben das schon leider ziemlich überschritten, dass Sie das mit dem Peter Duesberg direkt noch einmal besprechen, der ist den ganzen Tag hier. Ich darf jetzt endlich mit einer halben Stunde Verspätung die Pause eröffnen. Um 3/4 machen wir weiter, eine Viertelstunde Pause. Und ich darf noch ganz kurz hinweisen, Celia Farber hat eine Homepage, The Truth Barrier, und sie würde gerne Informationen und Updates von diesem Kongress bekommen und würde das dann online stellen auf diese Seite. Wer von Ihnen irgendeinen Bericht oder einen Aspekt von diesem Kongress der Celia schreiben möchte, kann das gerne tun und sie wird das auf diese Homepage stellen. Danke, bis in einer Viertelstunde.
Einschließlich die...
Danke, Peter.
Einschließlich die PowerPoints.
Ja.
Einzig die PowerPoints können wir die hier schicken auch. Sagt es. Das ist am einfachsten.
And a reminder, all PowerPoint presentations, all talks will be online, so you don't have to take notes.
Good, thanks.
Thank you, Peter.
Very good. Thanks a lot. Very good. Very good.